I am really honored to be here. It's very exciting for me. I love being with the people that are doing such important work inside companies, doing environmental health and safety, doing sustainability. You're the people that do the work that I study and write about and kind of honor in my work, I hope. But I want to, I think, step pretty far back. I think my job today is to provide a little bit of context for the rise of attention, the increasing attention at companies on environmental and social issues. Why is this happening? What does it really mean? What does it mean for business? Now, anybody from here? Anybody know what city this is? Just call it out. Anyone? No one's from here? Has to be. No, name a city. Anyone, just name a city. Okay, it is Los Angeles. I show this around the world. I show this in the US and get mostly wrong guesses, a lot of Salt Lake, Denver, and it's partly because it's a little bit of a trick question because LA is known for being pretty smoggy, right? And people don't quite realize what it looks like on a clear day often and how close the mountains are and what lifestyle could be in LA. But I want to take you back to the day of this picture, a time not too far back in recent human history, where there were pictures going around the world this week. I saw pictures of LA, I saw pictures of Sao Paulo and Beijing, and this is Milan and Delhi, and they were clean. And it was the cleanest air, I think, in the history of Los Angeles. So when was this? This is almost 4 years ago exactly, the second week of April. And it was a surprise. And now I don't want to suggest right now that the way to clean air is to shut down the global economy. That's not what I'm saying. But as someone who works in sustainability, we are often accused of painting doom and gloom pictures and showing how awful things could be. And I think sometimes we don't have the language or even the pictures to say, here's what we could build. Here's what we're doing. So I like to step way back and just remember, why are we doing this? And I will get into the business case for sustainability and all the value you can create and some of the details of how to build that kind of company that creates value for society that you heard about this morning. But it's good to remember why. So picture, we get to net zero in around 2050 in electricity, in vehicles, and I think we are headed there. I'm going to share some data on how fast things are moving, and I think we are going to get there. And over half the world's largest companies have net zero goals now. This is what our cities will be like, right? Right now, 8 million people die every year prematurely from air quality, and we just kind of accept that's part of doing business. It isn't. It won't be. And then I like to imagine that these cities also, the communities in the cities, the communities supporting them, the mining, the farming communities, the chemistry communities, the petrochemical, are actually living healthy, that those communities, the people are paid a living wage, that they have enough. This is the world we're trying to build together. It's a healthy, just, regenerative world. It's a better world, and we're heading there. Now, I get asked, for about 20 years I've been in this overlap of business and society, business and environment. I get asked very frequently, well, does sustainability pay? Doesn't it always cost more? I mean, I get asked this like literally daily. I do a lot of speaking, I do a lot of media interviews, and I have to talk about this all the time. And I'll say the short version is yes. Yes, it pays. And I'm going to kind of talk about that throughout my time with you. It's not as simple as that. Nothing pays immediately or obviously. Nothing in business is that simple. But yes, my first book, which came out almost 18 years ago now. My second son came out the same day that my first book did. And he's like this walking 6'3" lanky reminder of how long I've been doing this as he's becoming a young adult. And I have two, Gen Z boys, they are interesting as a generation. We'll talk about that. If anybody have teens and young 20s, I heard, yeah. No, everyone's like, yeah. It's tiring, I will admit, sometimes, but they're becoming young adults. So I came out with this first book with a co-author, and we laid out 4 big buckets of value creation. This is a pretty simplistic view of business, but it is really very logical. There's only so many ways we create value. We go to work every day, and we are doing things that either lower cost or lower risk, or we're building the upside. We're selling more, or we're building brand value, that very hard to measure thing that is actually the majority of the value of most companies now, the intangible value. Now, if you're not doing one of those 4 things, then you're treading water or maybe destroying value. But most of the time, we are doing one of those things. And if you take a sustainability view, a green lens, whatever you want to call it, you can find many examples of companies creating billions of value in each of these buckets. Some of the companies in this room, I am sure, have cut lots of waste, energy, water, and saved hundreds of millions, billions, some of the examples here. Companies that have managed risk. Companies with big food and ag supply chains are managing risk, or companies that have actually lost value because of risk mismanagement. Sometimes some things have gone wrong and they've lost billions in value, and it shows the value of managing this. Or on the upside, there are companies that have put out, we heard this morning about Tesla, kind of pure plays, to companies like BASF, who I think is probably in the room, who years ago did a really cool analysis looking at their portfolio, and you heard about it a little bit this morning too, where they look at their portfolio and say which products are more sustainable, which products are going to be part of the future where people want more sustainable products and services, and we're going to sell more of those fundamentally, right? And then on the intangible side, you have companies that have measured just solely the value to their business of attracting and retaining talent because they do more sustainability work. These are companies' examples where they found the value is hundreds of millions of dollars. Because you can measure what it costs to replace someone. And if you don't have to, you save a lot of money. So yes, it pays. Now, sustainability is always treated like this add-on, but we've been through that before in business. I think this audience would appreciate this more than most. If you go search bad safety, has anybody done this? There is just endless pictures of, this is not made up. There's a guy standing on a railing hanging a safety poster, but there's pictures of ladders on ladders, people holding people that are into pits, and there's 3 guys with a rope, like everything you can imagine. But safety was a thing that was added to business, right? It became a set of degrees and acronyms, and it took time. It took decades. 100 years ago, 120 years ago, there was child labor. And safety, OSHA, it wasn't even a thought. We've added this to business, and I guarantee you, and I've seen this, there's data showing and examples of industry associations that were ticked off about this 100 years ago and said, this is going to cost too much, just like they say about sustainability. Same thing with the quality movement, right? This is I'm sure there's people here with TQM who have degrees in this, they have certifications. This was added to business to make it better. And nobody now would say, we don't want our products and our manufacturing to be safe or high quality. Nobody would say that. But I'm sure there were conversations decades ago about Six Sigma. I don't need 1 in a million to be wrong. That's way too much. We can have 5 or 6 be wrong every million. It'll be fine, right? We are in a very fast changing time now. The world has been changing. In the last few years in particular, I've seen more change in what it means to be a business, what's expected of business, than in the 20 years I've been in this, easily. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The pandemic was clearly one of the reasons. And we saw companies doing things they had never really done before. They had to. I had one big client, industrial manufacturer, say, there were things we knew were going to happen maybe in our supply chains or over time that we thought we had years to do, and then we had weeks. And they figured it out. But one of my favorite examples was Medtronic. Medical device maker released the designs of portable ventilators so that the big car companies could manufacture ventilators because we didn't have enough. As a non-manufacturing guy, I don't fully understand how you make a car plant make ventilators, but that's up to the engineers, right? It seems like they're pretty different. But they did this. Now, was this short-term profit maximizing for Medtronic? Was this a thing you would do if you were going to go talk to your investors about what did we make this quarter? No. Was it the right thing? Yes. Was it both profitable? I mean, I think their stakeholders, their customers, and certainly their employees know what they did. And it was meaningful. It was a noble purpose, as you heard about this morning. So what I think has changed fundamentally is that now sustainability, it isn't just ESG, and we're getting lost now in so much of the reporting and the metrics, and we need all that. It shows the evolution of this field. But it is a larger story now. A company has to really talk about its role in society and who it serves. Who are you? What is your noble purpose? Who do you serve? Is it just shareholders? Is it something more? And the expectations of business now are global and broader. Surveys, Edelman and others that survey trust. Business has lowish trust, but it is higher than government. That's a low bar, but it is higher. And this has been found year after year in recent years. If you ask people, do you want your CEOs, do you want companies to speak out? They do. You'll hear angry voices, pundits, TV say, CEOs should stay quiet. That's not what people want. The vast majority want to hear you. As a CEO, as a business, where are you on climate? Where are you on discrimination and inequality? Where are you on the wealth gap and inequality? They want to hear it. And the other thing that happened in the last few years that was really kind of the final straw, I've been watching this space for a long time, looking at 15, 20 stakeholders, And there were a couple stakeholders that were lagging, and investors was one of them. But something changed. And you started to see investors come in now, and there's a lot of reason for this. I work with financial service companies. They feel pressure from their customers to have more ESG funds. All those things you're seeing are actual demand, right? So you started to see investors ask more questions, and the biggest, maybe most famous investor in the world is Larry Fink. He runs BlackRock. It is the biggest investor in the world. He has about 10 trillion under management. Now, he's been writing a letter every January to the CEOs of the world because BlackRock owns basically 2, 3, 4, 5% of every public company. They have that much money. And he's written an open letter saying, here's some priorities, I think. And for years, 5, 6, 7 years, it was about sustainability, ESG, climate. In the last year or two, he's gotten quieter about ESG. He took a lot of heat. But he kind of put this out right before the anti-kind of ESG movement got started, and I'll come back to that in a little bit, because if I didn't mention it during Q&A, I would definitely get questions about it. It's the most asked thing I get around the world is, what about this anti-ESG thing? And he's taken some heat, so he stopped using the phrase ESG as much, but meanwhile, they're still launching ESG funds, and they have huge inflows. And there's a lot of press about when someone pulls money from them over ESG, and it might be a couple billion from a state fund, and they are 10 trillion. Now, you guys are numbers people. 2 billion to 10 trillion is just not noticeable. So like their inflows are still huge. So he's careful about how he talks about it, but this is what he said a couple years ago. This is capitalism. Pleasing your stakeholders is what you do to create value. This is basically the same as my message. And so fundamentally, when I'm asked, does it pay? Yes, it pays to please your shareholders. They want to see your story on this. And we're now in a time, not just now, but we've really arguably been accelerating as a species, as an economy, since Industrial Revolution at exponential rates. When you see any chart of population, of economy, of emissions, of water use, they're all exponential, right? But it's more than that now. It's not just exponential, it's really complicated. The US military has this acronym VUCA. They also have FUBAR, which I won't tell you what that means, you probably know. VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. I mean, does that not perfectly describe the last 3 or 4 years in the world? Every year I'm like, how could something bigger or worse happen? And we keep getting there. And all I can tell you is we don't know what the black swans will be. They come. We now know they come. And companies have to be prepared. And there's 2 fundamental existential threats that, as I mentioned, Edelman shows people around the world want business to take part in solving. One is inequality. And it's not that there's rich and poor. There's always been rich and poor. And capitalism, that's part of what capitalism does. But what's changed is in the last 40 years in the Western world, all of the income and wealth has gone to the top 1%, or even the 0.1%, or the 3 guys who build their own spaceships. Like, it's all gone to the top. And what that's meant is that you have a middle and a lower income that have not seen any real wage gains, and they feel left behind. And it's destabilizing. It is actually destabilizing on our society. It hurts our ability to function as a society. And so companies are being asked to take part in this and think about this. And there's income inequality, and it connects directly to race and gender inequality, which people feel more directly in their business as they talk about DEI and all these things that also, can seem contentious. There's a real reason for it. The data shows that, say, a Latino woman makes a lot less than a white male for the same job. This causes tension. This is not stable. It's not healthy. It's not thriving. So companies are asked to do something about this. And the inequality that we're talking about of these dimensions is the S, right? And when we're talking about S, it's fundamentally these things, and that connects to human rights in the supply chain. It's all the same set of questions. Equality. Equality of opportunity, equality of outcomes. These are really tough questions. But of course, the biggest existential threat, and what I consider the final exam for humanity, is really climate change. I'm not going to talk about the science. I will just say that it is very, very serious, and it's very costly. So even if you want to just take the economic view, and I have an economics degree, I have an MBA, this is my view as well. If you want to look at the numbers, you can ask the big reinsurance companies. They're the ones that pay for extreme weather, and they know what's what. And so Swiss Re has said that if we don't manage carbon on the path we're on, we'll see a loss of 18 to 20% of GDP. There was just another study of almost the exact same numbers. I think they calculated 38 trillion of loss to the economy. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it is, but it also kind of sounds livable. We've had Great Depressions, and sometimes the economy shrinks. But I remind people that this kind of number is an average. It's their best estimate. There are places where GDP will go up and are starting to go up, like Canada, northern Russia, places where warmer means longer growing seasons, more tourism. It's better. I just saw an article this morning that beach resorts in Denmark, has anybody been to Denmark? You don't go for beach resorts usually. They're growing really fast because it's so hot in Spain, in Italy. This is changing the world. So there's places that gain from this. But for the most part, on average, we lose, and there's places that don't just lose 18%, they're talking about losing 100%. I grew up in South Florida. I don't believe there's a scenario right now where Miami exists in its current form in 30 or 40 years. There's no way, not on the path we're on. So how do we manage that? How do we think about the ROI as a society when there's places that will be binary? They lose 100%. And it's weird that I have to say this out loud, but it is really hard to sell more stuff of whatever you sell when someone's underwater, right? It's weird that we have to have this conversation about climate, to be honest with you. It is so existential in so many parts of the world that become unlivable. So I get accused at the end of my talks often of being too positive, too optimistic. So you're probably not thinking that right now. And if I stopped here and said, let's take some questions, it would be just the saddest keynote you've ever had. But we are moving exponentially, and there's some problems that are still moving, but we're also at this point, and I think we got here quite a while ago, where the cost of inaction, what I'm describing, these trillions, is way more than the cost of action. Way more. And I still hear all the time from people who want to maybe go slower on climate action, if we do this decarbonization, it'll destroy the economy. And I'm sorry, it's just ludicrous. Like, it's just ludicrous. It's destroying economies to do nothing. And in fact, it isn't just that it's so expensive and dangerous, it's that the cost of action has dropped so dramatically. So for example, the cost of renewable energy, this is data from Lazard, a bank, this isn't from Greenpeace, and people debate these numbers, but fundamentally, you go talk to a utility, I've talked to the CEO of the largest utility in the country and said, hey, you're heading to renewables. I just keep telling people on stage it's because it's cheaper, is that right? And he's like, yeah, that was the whole conversation, like that was it. It is cheaper. It is fundamentally cheaper to build renewable energy now. Now, the last couple of years, we've seen this weird uptick for the first time in 20 years in renewables, but also in everything else, and that's inflation, that's supply chain problems, it's ripples from the pandemic. But fundamentally, it's still cheaper. And this is where we're headed, and this is why it pays to move to renewable energy, and it's why you're seeing exponential growth in corporate purchases of renewables. This is not utilities. This is companies buying renewables either on-site or down the road for their business, and it is growing exponentially. And these are big numbers now, right? You're talking about 40 gigawatts. A gigawatt's like a big nuclear plant. These are big numbers now. We're also seeing an exponential reduction in the cost of batteries and storage. You can see there was a little uptick in 22, and then it started going down again. And while those numbers, because it started so high, 22 to 23 is actually a pretty significant percentage reduction if you look really closely. It's getting cheaper and cheaper. The scale of the battery industry is really growing. And this is why you're seeing an exponential growth in cars. It's not just that everyone wants EVs, they're just getting cheaper. They're getting cheaper to produce, and we're seeing this exponential rise. In 2022, total car sales globally actually went down, and EVs and hybrids actually went up exponentially. They still rose exponentially. Why? Well, it's happening everywhere, and there's some stories you'll see now about the US. It's really weird what happens in the news. They're talking about a slowdown in EVs here because we may only grow 30% instead of 40 or 50%. I don't know in any business that that's a slowdown. If you went into your CEO and said, here's my plan, we're going to grow 30% next year, and they said, get out. That's not 50%. So we're still growing, but it's also largely, in major part by China. They are investing a lot. They went from 3-4% of new vehicle sales being EVs or hybrid just a few years ago to 36-7%, and they're growing really fast. And this led to one of the headlines that kind of went by that most people didn't see last year that to me was monumentally important. Sinopec, which is the national oil company of China, said out loud, we think we are at peak oil demand. I've said peak oil and people go, oh no, we've said that before. I'm like, no, that's peak supply. We know we don't have peak supply. We keep finding more and more. This is peak demand. This is like you heard this morning about there was a point of peak demand of carriages before cars, right? And it doesn't mean when you look around you that everything is instantly green. All those numbers I've shown you on renewables and cars, it takes a while to change an infrastructure that's 100 years in the building, but we've passed the tipping point. And there's actually indications from the International Energy Agency that China might hit peak emissions for its economy this year. It's possible. I don't know, they're close. Now, there's some of that because they're slowing down in growth as well, but it's also been this massive commitment. It's not just cars. They've been putting EV buses on the road for years. They've been building renewables. They built the whole industry. They make almost all of the renewables, and they manage most of the metals, as probably some of you know in your business and in your value chains, that go into the clean economy. So exponential change happening, exponential opportunities, but companies are also under tremendous pressure from a series of stakeholders and a couple key megatrends. And one is just business-to-business pressure. This has been evolving for years and years. I've been studying this for 20 years, but clearly, and I hear it from people just anecdotally, even in the conversations in this room, about what are your customers asking? Why do you have to put together those safety data sheets? Why do they want to see your LCAs? But it's easy to point out companies asking for more data and kind of putting pressure on business. I like to find the ones that are not just the stick, but the carrot. And so I love this story from Tesco, the European retailer, and Santander, the bank, that Santander now offers to Tesco suppliers, the ones that are hitting really good ESG metrics, hitting science-based targets on carbon, they give them lower lending costs, lower operating costs for capital. And HSBC and Walmart are doing the same. So this is kind of becoming something that's an advantage. It pays to show your big customers that you are providing a smaller footprint product. But there's two fundamental pressures. And so I get asked, what if there's a recession, which seems to have died down a little in the discussion? What if there's continued inflation? Will this sustainability thing keep going? What about anti-ESG, which I'll come back to? But there's two things that are, I think, unstoppable and mean that this is going to continue no matter what anybody thinks. And one is transparency. That's just a natural course that's happening as we get more and more data rich in our lives. And my two Gen Z boys who have spent most of their lives on some form of iPhone, and I look at my Gen Alpha, they call it now, my nephew who's 12, 13, does not remember a time before an iPhone. My 20-year-old kind of does, right? It's all data, and they share everything. It's horrible, but they share everything. But this transparency is now not just something that's been building in, say, consumer products for years, what's called the clean label movement, which is all of us looking at labels and saying, what's in this product? I want to know the names of these ingredients. I want to know what's in it. I want to know where it came from, who made it, were they paid a living wage, what's the carbon footprint, and on and on. But it's now increasingly regulated, right? So there's the regulations demanding that companies measure even just on carbon their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and maybe scope 3. California has aggressive laws. The US SEC is kind of in pause mode, but it almost doesn't matter. Because, as you know, when California sets a level, it kind of affects the whole country, and most of you are probably in multinationals or serving multinational customers. The EU is going ahead really fast, and it's driving the world, right? So you're seeing more and more of this transparency demanded, and it's happening in regions, in countries. One of my favorite laws that launched last year was in Germany. It's called the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which I show only to make fun of it because it's one word. So I married into a German family, so I just find this, it's both the greatest and weirdest thing about their language, that it's just like, why add, spacebar? That just seems like a waste. Just one word. And I'm sure there's someone in the room, maybe from Bayer or someone who can pronounce this. I will not try, but this does mean something about German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. And of course, all these acronyms that are being thrown around, and they're growing, and the pressure is real, okay? But let's say you think all of that could go away, and this ESG thing could kind of slow down. There's a bigger problem, if that's a concern, if you don't want to go this direction. There's a bigger problem, which is it's generationally happening. Because nothing really shifts in the world fundamentally unless the norms change and the values shift. And you see young people wanting something different in their work. I sat this morning with one woman who said she's on the border of millennial. I'm definitely Gen X, and an executive here at Sphera who is Gen X. And we were talking about the Gen Z and their desire about the workforce, and my 20-year-old tells me that nobody's going to want to come work 5 days. No one's going to work in an office because he's decided he's the voice of a generation or something. I don't know. If anybody has a kid this age, you know what it's like. But they have different views. And in essence, the mornings, I decided what we were basically saying was kids these days. That was basically us, But look, I'm Gen X, so millennials. Let me ask, how many people are 42 and under, millennial-ish? Yeah, they're all in one place usually. Look at that. We usually put them in one place, and I hate to do this. I've been writing about the pressure from younger employees for 15 years. So I've been writing about this since millennials were getting into the workforce. And I really am sorry to break it to millennials. You're just not that young anymore. I'm sorry. I've realized as you're hitting 40 that I am now I turned 50 right at the beginning of the pandemic. That's a shock to the system, let me just tell you. 40 now I'm like 40 was peak. 40 was awesome. When I hit 40, I was like, what happened to 30? But now I'm like 40, I want to go back. But I've seen incredibly funny articles about millennials now having to manage Gen Z in the workforce, and my Gen Z boys make fun of millennials, which as Gen X, I just find hilarious and just gives me joy in a weird way. And the reason they make fun of them for being on things like Facebook, they just find them old. But the change is real. The measurement that happened when millennials were entering the workforce hasn't shifted. They actually haven't gotten considerably more conservative on, and I'm not talking necessarily politically, but on things like economy or policies. They haven't actually gone down that path as much as previous generations. So the data is still pretty clear that young millennials, mid-millennials, and Gen Z want something different from work. They want to share the values. They want to see that the company stands for something. So yeah, it pays. It pays for companies to be able to attract and retain talent. I've seen companies where the executives are probably the most skeptical of sustainability in general, but they believe this because they hear it from their own kids. Your typical CEO today, maybe young boomer, elder Gen X, has a millennial or a Gen Z at home, probably in the basement, like right now. And and I hear these stories, I see them where they say, hey, Dad, because most of the CEOs are dad, what's going on? What are you doing? And then the data that's coming out more and more is Gen Z now, as they're getting older, they have this huge influence on family purchases, and they are, according to EY, flocking to sustainable brands. Now, I always get as people get older, they're starting to buy and they don't look that different. You don't need a whole generation to shift. If 10, 15, 20% change their norms, it's a lot, right? It shifts what kinds of products make it. So what does this all mean for business? Lots of pressure, lots of exponential change. To me, fundamentally, there's all this scary stuff going on, but there's huge upside. We are remaking the world right now. We are rethinking and decarbonizing the way we make buildings. This is the Bullitt Center in Seattle. It makes more energy than it needs. That was really unique, maybe 15 years ago when it was built, I think. It's more and more common. How we get around, how we manufacture, food and ag, huge amount of stuff going on in food and ag. And all consumer products, financial products. These are multi-trillion-dollar markets, all in play, huge markets. And so this, to me, is the real change. The gigatrends I'm talking about, the problems like climate and inequality, the solutions, the clean tech, the demand, the transparency, the generational shift. These are the real trends. So when you see this pressure it's not entirely political theater, I'm being a little dismissive. The anti-ESG movement is having an impact on the US for sure. Clients, I've seen this, companies are doing what's called green hushing, if you've heard that, which is instead of greenwashing, they're being quiet. They're a little afraid to talk about certain things. I'm seeing that, but it's a really American phenomenon for the most part. Most of my business is actually global. I speak abroad all the time. This is the number one thing I'm asked about, is what's going on with anti-ESG, sometimes in the vein of, does this mean we don't have to do all this anymore? Can we slow down on this? Because in some regions, especially I find in Asia, in South America, they feel a little bit like, okay, the EU and the US have decided that we have to do this ESG thing, and we know what we're doing. We know how to reduce our footprint. We know our EHS, and they get kind of annoyed about it, but it is moving, right? As I said, it's becoming regulatory. And I've also seen, I think, pretty smart CEOs here just say, fine, like Larry Fink, if I'm going to tick off some people calling it ESG, I just won't. This is the CEO of Coca-Cola, and I've seen quotes like this quite a bit. Doesn't matter to me, I'm just going to stop saying it. My business strategy is clear. It's centered around the things that consumers want. I'm going to help fix problems in the world. I'm going to give them a good product that tastes good. I'm going to do all these things. It's going to create value. I'm going to help solve problems. Everything you heard this morning, right? There is purpose. And they believe this is what it matters to their customers. So I think you're going to see the work continue. And from what I've seen, the work is continuing. If your business started to decarbonize, you have capital out there. You don't really care if someone's saying something in a stump speech about ESG. Right? I think it's affecting certain topics for sure, the social side maybe more, but in the end, these things are moving. They're fundamentally moving. And so where does this leave us? Well, I think in particular on climate, we have to go faster. We need to be moving much quicker than we are, and it's not enough just to be less bad. That's been fundamentally the sustainability plan, is incremental change. And we have to step up, right? It isn't enough to say, well, we'll just set the right kinds of laws, it'll all be government. It has to be really all legs of society, but business is where I focus. Business has to not just take the lead. I think I think they just have to be part of the solution, a very big partner. And so I started working with Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever for 10 years. And he was really probably the best known large company CEO on sustainability. He made this his thing. He was also, people sometimes mistake him for like a Greenpeace guy. He had been the CFO of Nestle for a decade. Then he ran one of the biggest consumer products companies in the world for a decade. He is very clear about wanting profits. Like, he was not anti-money at all. He saw sustainability as the lens, as the driver of value at Unilever. And I think for his 10 years, it was very successful. But we got together and said, look, things need to move faster. It isn't enough just to say, let's try to be more sustainable. We want to push the agenda and say, let's be net positive. And what that means is that we as a business, we profit by solving problems, not causing them. And we improve the well-being of everybody that we touch in any way across our value chain. And for a multinational like a Unilever, that's arguably everybody. Right? So it's a big view. And the question we fundamentally have asked is the world better off because your business is in it? And I find that gives people pause. And those of you finding your way into middle age, again, welcome millennials, you find yourself asking this about your own work. Does it matter? Did it matter? Did I leave the world better off? These are these questions, especially as I'm heading to empty nest in a few months. I'm not freaking out about it at all. But it is a moment. Right? Like, are my kids helping the world, or are they just a pain in the ass? Like, what are they doing in the world? And what are the principles of this kind of business beyond just normal, successful business? And at core, it's about taking ownership, and I'll come back to that in a second. It's a long-term view. It is multi-stakeholder, and these are hard things, fighting that short-term shareholder pressure. One of the first things that Paul did when he became CEO in 2009 was he told basically Wall Street and investors, I'm not going to talk to you every quarter. I'll report what I need to legally, but I'm not doing quarterly planning. And it's not like internally they didn't report on things about different divisions or products, but he said to his middle management, senior management, you have a little more leeway. Think about it in year terms or multi-year terms. He still wanted results, but it was like, let's take a longer view. It is multi-stakeholder, isn't just shareholders, but we specifically name shareholders as one of the kind of 5 principles that shareholders will do well. But it's because you've solved problems and made the world better and made lives better in the other stakeholders. And it's about partnership, which I'll come back to at the end. Deep, transformative partnership. But this ownership idea is a really interesting one. It's responsibility, but maybe not in the CSR kind of way, but just responsibility like we teach our kids. You know the phrase, you break it, you own it? If your kid's running around a store and they break something, you have to buy it. Well, arguably business, we've kind of cracked the world a little, and we've all done it as consumers, and we kind of own this. We should own this. It also yields a tremendous amount of opportunity. And we've gotten used to, in this space, and I appreciate the host making those of us who remember pre-scopes feel old. Thanks for that. Talking about scopes have just been around now, but they weren't always. But that idea of scope 1, 2, 3, which I don't think I have to explain to you, we looked at some other folks that were playing with this idea, and we said, there's broader views. There's broader views in this, and you could argue, call it scope or impact level 4 is your sector. And this is how you get to things like circular. You can't really talk circular without really talking to the whole sector. And regenerative, which is almost, synonymous with net positive. It's a very similar idea. The area that I've been spending more and more of my time on is what we call level 5, which is policy. This disconnect most of the time between companies, their big sustainability goals, their big climate goals, and what they're saying maybe in Washington or Brussels, what their trade associations are saying, and this disconnect in a transparent world is getting harder. And we need companies to embrace what we call net positive advocacy, helping get the laws moving towards the kinds of solutions that are systemic. And then at the largest level, it might be for a CPG company, something like, what's our contribution to just consumption, to fossil fuel? How do we think about this? And you can do this not just for carbon, which is what the scopes are about, but think about it on the social side or the human side. If you're, say, a farming or a food company and you have farms in your supply chain, you're going to care about employee safety. All of you are in that business, and you care about the well-being, call that level 2. But you get into these larger levels about, well, what are the communities like for our employees? What are the communities like in the supply chain, the farming communities or the mining communities in that sector? And then what are the policies? Are we encouraging, if we're in the food business, regenerative agriculture and nutrition laws that help us make sure people are healthier? Or do we work on the biggest things, making sure there's no hunger? How do we feed what's going to be at least 9 billion people within the thresholds of the planet? How do we do that? Now, I'm not suggesting anybody sitting here is going to solve hunger or consumption. But it is something that every company can take a part in and say, how do we help? How do we help solve some of these big questions? Because we're not going to solve them unless we start addressing them systemically. And I can't point to any company that's net positive. That's not really possible yet. The systems aren't in place. But there's companies doing pieces of it. You heard of some of them this morning. IKEA, long a leader in this space. They now make more energy on store than they need. That is, by definition, net positive on energy. But they're also going beyond that and selling solar in the stores to consumers. Good business, but they're also making the multiplier of carbon reduction much higher than their own footprint. So it pays. This is what it looks like to see a piece of your business be net positive. We also need a different kind of leadership. This is where I call on really everybody in the room to think about what kind of leader you are in your world. We admire Ajay Banga, who ran MasterCard for many years. He's now the head of the World Bank, which was an interesting transition. And he's written in the past about DQ, decency, not just IQ, but how much do you care? Do you care about people? Do you care about your employees, your customers? How much do you care about the problems we face? And the kinds of principles of this net positive leader, courage is really the core. So Paul Pullman and I are talking about a next book or maybe a podcast. We're trying everything, but anything that reaches people. And we're thinking courage is really the core of this. We need courage. It's hard. It is really hard. It takes courage to be humble, to put yourself out there and say, you know what? I want to lead with my own purpose, my own empathy, and I want to seek partnership. It takes courage to go to critics. We heard some of that earlier today too, to go to critics, go to NGOs that are critical and say, okay, we want to solve this problem, we want to make this material circular, or we don't know how to scale up some part of our business that we think is more sustainable. You have a lot to say about it, Greenpeace or WWF or whatever. What do you know? Can you help us? And I think there's now this need, and this is the world I've gotten into more and more in the last year or two, has been more exec ed stuff. I'm not an academic. I'm a business guy by training. But this idea of upskilling, I'm seeing this demand in companies for getting just a fluency in these issues. Understanding the climate issue, just kind of the nature of it, the big laws around it, but just getting it as a strategic issue. That's the kind of upskilling we need. So what does it look like to build this kind of business? I'll give you a few thoughts before we take a bunch of questions. So I think there's something about the way we make investment decisions. This has been a kind of pet peeve of mine for years. Whatever you want to call it, ROI, IRR, net present value, there's some version of measuring what it costs to go do something. And we're very good at saying, here's how much cash. And then we're pretty good at saying, here's how much cash we expect to come out. And then we go, that's the ROI. But we're really missing some things. There's a bunch of things that are not value to society. That's externalities, that's even more. This is the value to the business, being more resilient, building that loyalty with customers and employees. These are larger conversations, and we don't put good numbers on those things. So we sometimes just call it zero. And so I think we're underinvesting systematically in things that are investments. I mentioned before safety, quality. Almost everything in business costs money. When I get asked questions about, well, doesn't sustainability always cost more? I'm finding it increasingly confusing because everything costs money. Marketing costs money. There's no free, right? So why do we always put this burden that it has to pay back immediately? This assumption that sustainability must be a drag on value. I think it's because we don't really think of it as an investment as much as it is, rather than just a cost. So it does pay if we take this broader view of value. And I will point out how many people in the room, how many in your companies are seeing a rising expense on AI in your business? If anybody's not raising their hand, they're lying. It's everywhere. Every company, every client. Does anybody, raise your hand if you seriously think your company knows the ROI on their AI investment? because I want to talk to you if you think that's true. Nobody knows. And I don't believe that most companies probably have to spend on, say, educating everybody in their business on AI, right? And maybe, but there's a lot of money flowing. What's the ROI? We don't know. And what is the role of AI in sustainability? Well, it's complicated. It's really complicated. I think certainly AI is already being used to make traffic systems better, building systems, manufacturing systems. It's going to make us more efficient, smarter, predicting weather patterns, all sorts of things. It's also being made to make data centers more efficient, which is good because AI is also driving up the demand for data centers and power dramatically. You have a bunch of grids now that are worried about how are they going to keep up. And it's not from economic growth. We've gotten more efficient per dollar of GDP. It's this. It's AI and cryptocurrency. It's driving this massive growth of energy demand. That's problematic from a climate perspective. And I don't think we have good solutions to that. So it's complicated. Now, part of building this kind of business is setting the right kind of goals. Most of the businesses in the room, I'm sure, have sustainability goals. There's ones that I think are bigger, where you have companies starting to really think in these more systemic, net positive ways. Microsoft set a goal to capture carbon equal to all of their emissions since they were founded. That's like a retroactive neutrality that I had never seen before. I think it's kind of remarkable. Google has a similar goal. They have another one that I really love, which is by 2030, which is now getting close, right? It was a few years ago, it seemed far. They want to have only green electrons. Now, what does that mean in practice? That means a lot of on-site storage, a lot of on-site generation, a lot of storage, and then, since they're going to plug into most grids, they need to change the grid. And you can go on their site and see how they talk about this. They're working on community solar. They're working on systems. That's what it looks like to be net positive. You have companies all over the world setting goals also on kind of nature. How do we be nature positive in our resources? Sonai, the big Portuguese-based retailer. Zero carbon, but also nature positive. Walmart's the biggest company by revenue in human history, and they say they want to be regenerative. It's just like net positive. Kering, big apparel company, net positive in biodiversity. Let's look at the land that we affect through, say, all of the apparel we sell, the cotton. You have companies like MasterCard and others setting these really pretty aggressive, broad goals on society. I've been tracking goals on sustainability for 10, 11 years on a database called pivotgoals.com. It's public. And we track the top 200 companies in the world. And for many years, goals around social stuff were really vague. They weren't quantitative, a lot of them. It's so common now to see this is our gender parity goal, this is our kind of racial parity goal within management, within the board. It was all really vague for years. And so there's more and more of these very quantitative goals, like MasterCard saying we want to get 1 billion people who are underbanked into the system. That's good for them, obviously. It's growth. We want to help small business. We want to help women entrepreneurs. These are the kinds of goals you're seeing. And so you all, as I would call broadly middle management, and before someone goes, I'm not middle, I mean it really broadly. Like middle management includes up to running a brand, running a factory. Middle management in Walmart is someone who runs a Walmart store. There's 5,000 store managers who run businesses that are $200 million. So that's middle, but in a very broad way. It's kind of in a very academic sense. And Paul and I wrote this story in Harvard Business Review about driving change from that senior middle place. And we have kind of a maturity curve. And people have seen many maturity curves on sustainability. I won't belabor it. I'll skip level 1, which is, I don't care, which I don't see much in US companies anymore. But there's certainly most companies in the room in different parts of your business are going to be at kind of a couple key levels, where maybe part of the business is building its base now of sustainability. You heard this morning, how do you get started? And the leader in the middle, your job in a way is to build the capabilities now, to get that systems and data in place. That's what this company helps you with, right? Is getting that data, getting the benchmarks, starting to embed it into how the business, and find those stars, star people, star products, and nurture them. The next level are the companies that really want to accelerate. They are ready to move forward. They're ready to start leading. They need to speed up. They need to find the non-EHS sustainability leaders in the business, right? Someone who's in marketing, someone who's in procurement, who has an itch to do more. And they start asking these bigger questions. And what are the partnerships that we can be a part of? And then that kind of last level is net positive. There's not that many companies that are there, but there's pieces of businesses that are. And this is about starting to think much bigger and think about what we call the elephants in the room, things like executive pay and human rights and taxes and these really hard things that are hard to manage, but really make it hard to claim that you are net positive if you're not managing them right. And how do we get into the kind of transformative collaborations and the advocacy to change the system, to make it easier for all of us? At the core of all this is fundamentally partnerships. And I've talked about this. This is really the core. And what it means is that we start to shift our thinking about the initiatives we have in sustainability, in EHS. So right now, I'd say most businesses, they're doing things that are kind of within their own control. Right? It starts with let's get more efficient, let's do zero waste, whatever it is. Right? We have those goals. And there might be a mix of some other things that come into play where you're working with your value chain, you're working with your sector, or working on the full system. I think if we're being honest, the kind of bottom part of this for most businesses is the vast majority of the initiatives and the impact. We don't have that many systemic partnerships yet. But in the future, I believe where we're headed and need to head is that we kind of flip that pyramid. And the stuff we do today, all that stuff is taken for granted increasingly. Of course we reduce our footprint. Of course we manage waste. And then we start building these, what we call 1 + 1 = 11, where you get these multiplier effects, and you start to address the system. And so this might look like, say, with packaging, you're doing the efficiency. Let's get more efficient on packaging. You heard about Amazon starting to address how do we design this better. You might get into the recycling infrastructure with your sector, with your suppliers, and you're getting into these multipliers. The larger systemic question gets you into reusable, package-free stores. It gets you into a very different category. And I know some of you are in those conversations, right? But it's almost just the beginning. And so the question I kind of ask is, what are your shared hurdles? Because I get a question after almost every talk saying, yeah, but in my sector, it costs more to do sustainable products. People just say that. And I'm like, okay, but what costs more? Does it? Is it that the system's not in place? Is there a material? Is there some element of the supply chain that costs more now? Does it need scale? Who needs to be at the table to make that not true? To solve how do we work the problem? How do we get together collectively to show the courage that we need? And the partnerships that I've seen that are really innovative are changing the system. Apple has a partnership with Rio Tinto and Alcoa that is changing the way aluminum is made. This is Apple. They wanted to decarbonize their products. They're not actually, as many products as they have, they're not huge in aluminum, right? Aluminum's in buildings and cans and cars. I mean, it's much bigger. But they've worked with aluminum suppliers and built a new kind of business that is basically zero carbon. And they bought the first batch of this new aluminum, and it was more expensive at first, but they're getting to scale. But the second batch was bought by Audi for an electric car. So that to me is a ripple. That is net positive. You're seeing sectors come together. This is the stuff I get optimistic about. Behind the scenes, there's these sectors that are always called the hard to abate sectors, and many of you are in the room, right? This is aviation and shipping and steel, cement, and they're coming together in these partnerships now. And it's not just talk. A stat I saw just a few months ago was that 43% of the planned steel capacity is now going to be electric arc furnaces. And this is where I pretend I'm an engineer and know what that means. But I do know it means you're basically plugging it in. It's electric, not using fossil fuels. It's much lower carbon. We're seeing this. So I want to end with two stories that are around Unilever, since I work with them closely on gathering kind of information on how you do this. And I've been saying all along this is good for business and basically saying it's not philanthropy. Well, this is going to sound like philanthropy for the moment, but it's not. So the largest, I think, partnership between a business and an NGO is Unilever and UNICEF. They've been doing these hand washing campaigns for a number of years, and they really accelerated under my co-author. And the reason is that 5 million kids die every year from diseases that are easily transmitted and avoided if they learn how to wash their hands. And so using this one brand from Unilever, Lifebuoy soap, which was actually their first brand from the 1870s and was stagnant as a brand, hadn't gone anywhere in decades. They started doing these campaigns. Now this is how the brand goes out to the world. This is how the marketing people, this isn't just some cause-related marketing, this is the things they do. Now, if you've had little kids, you know that they don't stand still for 30 seconds to wash their hands like they're supposed to. And in India, South America, the places they did this, water wasn't always plentiful. So the marketing people, the brand people went back to R&D and said, hey, can you make this so it does it quicker? And they found a way to kill the germs in 10 seconds, and then they also had it change colors. So in 10 seconds, it would turn green, and the kids would know they were done, which was super fun. They had comic books around this. It was fun. So we like to say this is value from values. This is growth. Lifebuoy became a billion-euro brand. It started growing at like 14% a year, which for soap is torrid growth. Like, this isn't software, right? Like, that's ridiculous. This is growth. And then finally, we're talking about real systems change. And one of the toughest systems in the world is some of the things we grow, in particular palm oil, which is in so much of what we eat, so much of what we put in our bodies, and it's what makes Indonesia the 4th largest emitter by country in the world, because there's so much deforestation. Now, the big buyers, big consumer products companies, have been demanding more sustainable palm oil from suppliers for years and just failing miserably. But starting 5 or 6 years ago, there was this decline that began in the deforestation rate. We had kind of turned the tide. And the reason was fundamentally that the big buyers didn't just go and complain to suppliers. They brought in local small farm holders. They brought in municipalities, the government. They brought in Greenpeace and WWF. They brought in everyone. And the NGOs had better practices. They said, here's some species we know that can be twice the yield. But then the farmers needed something else, which was money. You can't transition to new species without skipping a growing season or two. So the Norwegian Sovereign Fund and other big companies came in and provided money, and so this started to actually work. And you're starting to see a reduction in this district by district work. It is hard work. This is how you get to healthy forests, healthy animals, healthy people, and business. This is how we build a thriving world. And this is what it's all about. In the end, we cannot thrive in business unless people and planet are thriving as well. So I ask you to consider how you'll be net positive in your lives, in your work, with your families. And if we all ask that question and answer it, it will absolutely save the world. Thank you very much. So they told me to go a little long because you guys were very quiet during Q&A period earlier this morning. So I did kind of extend, so we only have 16 minutes instead of 25. But I'm also around a little bit after for lunch. But I am hoping, I've never seen an audience have no questions. I mean, I know you all obviously agree with everything I said. But I'm sure there's questions. I get many. Please be the brave one to come out. I won't bite. There's someone right there. I think we have mics. Wait, there's someone back there, and then there was one right over. I can't really see back there. So
check. Andrew, first of all, wow. Amazing. My question is, how do companies start on the journey to net positive, fundamentally?
Yeah. Well, I would say there's authors you could read and buy stuff from, but and I think that includes, honestly, the Sphera CEO. These books matter. The books take time. They take a lot of thinking and thought, and I'm sure he's put a lot into it. For us, one of the things we put online was what we just call a readiness assessment. And it kind of asks 24, 25 questions there's a website, netpositive.world. And it kind of makes sense. The first batch of questions are things like, and you heard this morning, what is your footprint? Where are your impacts? Just get that basic data together. It starts to listen to your stakeholders more. What do the key stakeholders expect? Look at your employees, your customers, your suppliers, your communities. What do they expect now and in the future? Get this basic information. Now, I think a lot of companies have much of that in the works, have that in place, they're tracking it. Then you start to get into things like, okay, like I said before, what are the shared hurdles? What are the problems? For me, the really getting started is, what are the things that are standing in the way? What problems do we need to work? What's the problem? And who needs to be at the table to help solve that problem? And those are the kind of first deeper steps. But just even getting all the information together or getting some of the right people to the table is obviously a way to get moving. I don't find many multinationals have no data yet, right? That's why you're all here. But there's still so much to be learned about our operations and increasingly about tier 1 and now tier 2, 3 suppliers, getting that full picture of the system. But there's so much more information now than there used to be. There was something called the Sustainability Consortium that started 15 plus years ago that Walmart started, and there's people in the room I'm sure were members. And they basically, with academic partners and big companies, they came up with kind of value chain footprint of 100 product categories. So we now kind of know where the footprint is. If you make a food product and it's got any dairy in it, your footprint's the cow. Right? We know that now. And so I think the information is out there to say, here's generally where our issues are. So now that real first step is, okay, what are the problems keeping us from fixing this or getting much lower carbon on this, and who do we need to bring together? How do we get to scale? Those kinds of questions. That's where I would really start the conversation. There was one over here. That's all I can see, and there's one up here. There's this gentleman right here, if you can see him, in the red, I think, collar. Surprisingly difficult, actually.
So from the EV's carbon footprint, how does so for the lifetime of an EV, obviously there's less carbon footprint than like a typical regular car, but how does manufacturing and like the power plants using fossil fuels, how does that all play into the total production? Because my understanding it's like you need to look at the total thing, and where is production in reference to that?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I sometimes have slides about it. I mean, you said it at the beginning. You said, obviously the life cycle is smaller for EVs. That's just the fundamental truth. It's actually just massively smaller. Like, there's a lot of talk right now about EVs, and I'm not being a smartass when I just say EVs aren't magic. Like, they're not perfect. And sometimes what happens is you see a proposition or a movement towards new technologies, and it's so easy to attack them about their footprint, because there is one. But we kind of lose sight of the system, right? When you hear data about, here's the footprint of those metals, of putting together the EV batteries, of the extra energy it takes to make a battery versus an engine, all of that's true. But what you never talk about is the footprint and energy required to power a fossil fuel-based combustion engine, right? All it takes to get oil from the ground or get coal for the grid. The data I've seen says that if you switched pretty much most of our transportation system and electric system to clean economy over the next 30, 40 years, just on the mining question, which has been a big question people have, the volume of like material you have to dig up in the world and put into things like clean economy, the volume of the current fossil fuel system, if we didn't do that, would be about 500 times more stuff. So it's not close, actually. And then on a carbon level, part of what's important about EVs to think about is the systemic nature of it, meaning as the grid gets cleaner, the cars that are now plugged into it means you're hitting two major issues at once, right? And so even cars that are plugged into pretty dirty grids are still cleaner, because there's just a thermodynamic reality of EVs, which is, anybody have any people, I'm sure, have EVs. Have you noticed when it's cold that your mileage, your yield, do you know why? This is amazing. The reason when it's cold, it's not that the battery stinks, it's that you're trying to heat the car. And with an internal combustion engine, there's so much heat coming off the engine, that's what heats your car in the winter. You don't have that because the battery's so much more thermodynamically efficient that you actually have to use the power from the battery to heat the car, right? So just think about that for a minute, right? Instead of losing 60, 70% through heat, the EV's just more efficient. So it's just a more efficient system. It doesn't mean there's not mining. It doesn't mean there's not footprint. It doesn't mean there's not human rights issues in those metals, but there's human rights issues in fossil fuels. So this is not a reason not to change. So I think we're going to see those concerns, and there's going to be, and it's fair enough. It's a fair question, but we have to take a look at the full system, and it's just not even close. And so I get frustrated a lot because I see these articles, and every magazine thinks they're going to write this surprise story every 6 months. Did you know that EVs have a footprint? Yes. Of course they do, right? But there's also this amazing amount of innovation going on now. I'm talking next week. I apologize to anybody in chemistry who's in EHS who might be at the ACC meeting next week, because you'll be seeing me again. I might see some of you again. And the options in like new chemistries, the innovation opportunities for different kinds of batteries, for end of life of batteries, these are all innovation opportunities. So I just, at the macro sense, even if we don't know what to do with batteries, I'd rather a pile of batteries than climate change. Like we're in triage mode. We're not in perfection mode. And we should be really honest about that, right? We've waited way too long to change our system. So there's going to be problems, but those are often huge opportunities. So I see this, yin-yang to it all. But I think the EV and clean economy system is just a far better path for us for many, many reasons. I'm sure someone's going to come up and tell me why that was completely wrong. But I've read a lot about this too. I think it's, I think there was one up here. There's one over there. If we get another mic over here. Yep, go ahead.
Great talk, and by the way, the Sustainability Consortium's methodology lives on Sphera.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
We power it.
Yeah.
I have a question. So we're talking about investment, right? And marketing is an investment, and there's an ROI.
Yeah.
And visionary leaders can convince their boards, their shareholders, et cetera, that this multi-year, 2030 net zero investment is worth it, right? What tools can you give to folks that they want to do it?
Right.
Personally, right? Because it is fundamentally about people. They want to do it, but they need to, quarterly results are quarterly results, right?
Yeah, look.
What are some of those intermediate things that you can give to decision makers to convince their financially focused stakeholders?
Yeah. Well, so this is a version of, doesn't it always cost more? How do we justify this? This is a version of kind of the question that I spend a lot of my time on. So there's a tactical answer, which is I gave a taste of, which is looking at all the value that is created in the business and actually putting numbers on it. So I have a colleague who's kind of the world expert on putting a value on things that seem hard to value. And he has this very simple tool he does with clients where he says, how much do you think it's worth to you in employee retention or whatever to do X better on sustainability or to show that you've got better products or your values? And he has the executives go play with the numbers and say, okay, I think we'll retain people 5% better if we do X, Y, Z. And the value number is always so much larger than people realize, like orders of magnitude. Like the guess it'll be like a few $1 million to a multi-billion-dollar business, and it's like 300 million, right? It's that number I showed at the very beginning of the intangible. Those companies like Unilever and one of the big consulting firms, the numbers they had put on the value of retention was like tens of millions of dollars. So there's things like that we're just bad at putting numbers on with just a little bit of effort. We can say, look, this resilience, there's resilience in going to clean economy, to going to clean energy, like there's all these other benefits. The more strategic thing I keep kind of pushing on people about is what I said about like AI. So I got an economics degree, something years ago. And it's worthless. And I don't mean because, it was not a great school. It's that I learned that we maximize utils and we draw supply and demand curves. And then there were people who got Nobel Prizes in the last 30 years for behavioral economics and behavioral psychology. And the reality is we don't make decisions on numbers. We tell ourselves we do, and we somehow believe that executives, CEOs, because they're better people, are doing it all on numbers. They don't, not even CFOs. We make decisions for many reasons. And we pay the top people pretty big money to make strategic decisions, to see something bigger. And then we look for the data behind it. And I will just tell you very quickly, I did a study a number of years ago with a bunch of CEOs that talked about sustainability. And I never released any results because it was there wasn't in a way anything to say, because I would say to them, why do you care about sustainability? The business case that I had spent years building was like the fourth reason. There was other things in there. Number one was my kids talked to me. Number two was I went to go see something like a rainforest or the Antarctic, and I thought, oh, crap. It was very personal. And I've sat in meetings a number of years ago with a top guy at a big hospitality company, and I said, hey, you're spending millions of dollars on going mobile technology so you can check into your room with your phone. I said, how do you know that's valuable? Because we just know. What do you do with that? How do you replicate that? One CEO said, oh, yeah, I care about sustainability. He was the CEO of 3M at the time. I said, why do you care? He goes, I'm Swedish. I'm like, what do I do? I mean, which is why I never wrote an article, because I can't make everyone Swedish. But I can try to challenge the idea that we are not making decisions about massive investments all the time. That's my point about AI right now. It is a huge amount of money going in without that. And why are they allowed to go into their investors or into their boardroom and say, because they're being asked, why aren't you putting it into AI? And we almost never have that conversation about sustainability. And it's literally killing us. So you can say I get frustrated because I write about this, I talk about it, I've been doing it for 20 years. And I need a break. I'm tired, I think. But it's like, I just don't know how we get to this place where people see that all these things we're doing for sustainability are not just because the owls like it. Like, it sounds ridiculous to have to say, but you know that we live within the planet. And I find that to be the big aha that got me into this field 20 years ago was to go, oh, right. I was taught in econ that environment, that's like this little niche within business, and we still operate that way, right? Somehow, and there are CEOs like Bezos and others that have been genius at making investors wait years and years. Pharma does this. Pharma says it's going to take us 17 years to get this drug out. Somehow some things get into that category and some things don't. And so my job in the world is partly to say, hey, there's a bunch of things here like decarbonizing, green chemistry, dematerializing, whatever, that are just should be in this bucket. And we do it because it's better business. And then we work backward and say, how do we do that most profitably? How do we compete on that? Not, are we going to do it? If I had an easy answer to that, I would be doing, I don't know what else I'd be doing, but I'd be, this is my partly my answer. It's both tactical and just strategic, just philosophical. On that note, anyone? There's more. Oh, there was one right here. Did you have a question? Oh, that was it? Okay. How do we make the case? Good. I don't know if that helped. It's hard to go to your CEO and go and say, you're not making decisions on numbers. But it's true. Come on, we all know it. We make decisions on multiple dimensions. The numbers matter, of course. But it's almost like they have to be there in that, it's that split second brain thing that there's been so much studying on now. We make these gut decisions about what we know is right. And then we kind of look for the data. Yes.
Which countries are most progressive and innovative in sustainability?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define sustainability. If you take it in the sense of thriving, I don't think there's any better measure than whether people are happy. And Scandinavia seems to do pretty well. They always have. And it's really cold and dark. And so they're happy. I honestly, seriously, as someone who grew up in Florida, I can't imagine living where it's dark 8 months of the year. And yet they're happier in general. People tell me, oh, there's suicides. I'm like, yes, there's suicides everywhere. But yes, on average, they keep coming out on top. And in the OECD countries, we're at the bottom. Why? I don't think there's easy answers to this, right? But some of it's about community. Some of it's about how connected these places feel. And that's part of why it's easier for them to have really high safety nets, because they feel like they're related. And in a place like Iceland, they literally are. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. These are smaller countries. Right? The connection level, even just genetically in some of these, is tighter. It is. We are this hodgepodge for good and bad, and it's harder to have that kind of common good conversation. But Scandinavia seems to do this well, and there's tons of countries that have pieces of it, right? Like I was just in Costa Rica a couple weeks ago, and they have this pura vida phrase, and they really mean it. There's just it's not like there's not people doing crappy jobs and they look miserable, and there's farmers. I mean, there's jobs, there's hard jobs, but there's just this sense of hey, it's hot, but it's pretty nice out, and are we happy or not? And that's really what matters. And I think we have a very big drive for success here, which is great in many ways. But sometimes I think the places that are a little calmer about life seem to be happier. And obviously the policies, I'm only half kidding, the policies then drive that. So in Norway, I think 60-70% of cars sold last year were EVs. There's policies behind it. They're driving it. They're making it easier. They're making the markets for it. The US is fascinating because we get there with much less regulation than the EU. And that has some very good aspects, which is when companies get there, they get there because they've been convinced of the total business case we've been talking about, of all those ranges of value. And that means, in a way, it sticks. I've been told, because I travel so much, wherever I go to Europe, you Americans, you're not very sustainable. I keep getting told how much farther ahead they are, and it's not always true. It's not. It's true in that they follow the law, and the law goes faster there. And right now it's true because of all of the laws, making us disclose. But in general, when you start to think about the companies that have really led in sustainability, of course there's European leaders, but there's a ton here, right? Who was the retailer that first really started moving the needle? It was Walmart, right? And they're not perfect, whatever, but they moved the needle on suppliers. They meant it. And you see that in a lot of companies here. The companies that are buying the sequestration, that are trying to invent the way to sequester carbon, are the big tech companies. Right? So we lead, and the biggest buyers of renewables, the tech companies. So we lead in our own way, and I think we can lead. We just miss that happiness part, which is pretty big, right? So, all right, I think I made it through without talking about elections or anything going on. People ask me what I think is going to happen. I'm like, I don't know. Why would I know? People think you're on stage, you have an answer. I'm like, I do not have an answer. Anything? I think I'm over, actually. But I think one more question, and then there's lunch, maybe?
Yeah, I got one more question for you, because you talked about AI getting all these investments, and sustainability doesn't. So there's a clear reputational problem around sustainability.
Yeah, there is.
And you're an MBA, I'm an MBA, and I feel sometimes lonely in the regulatory space, because they're all engineers and very, very high qualified people there. But do we need to get more of this business thinking into the regulatory space to explain it better to the CEOs of the companies?
Yeah, and vice versa, right? I mean, I think there probably needs to be a mix of people from lots of backgrounds in lots of different roles. I think it would help, right? I think it's, I think, you know, not for nothing, I never say that phrase, but not for nothing, Apple really took off as a sustainability leader when Lisa Jackson came in. They were already doing plenty, but Lisa Jackson had been the head of the EPA. Like, that was a reverse thing that seemed odd at first, but has been pretty cool, right? So I think, yes, you need some business people to be in government. You need some, I think, maybe people that have been in regulation and government to be in business more. And that happens, obviously, more than probably I know. But, like, I think you need that mix, right? And I think, hopefully, kids are coming out of school. I now call anybody in their 20s kids. That's how old I am. But, like, people coming out of grad school with multi-majors now is much more common, and I think they're coming with joint degree. I think there's much more of that joint kind of idea. Let me take multiple paths to something. That's what we need for systemic thinking. It's going to be challenging, but we need broad, flexible thinkers, and having at least different views in the room. Going back to the very first question, how do we solve it? What's the first step? What do you need in the room, right? And it's really bad when it's all the same. We've seen that in study after study. So I agree with you. We just need to cross-fertilize. And on the phrase cross-fertilize, I think I will say we should go eat. Thank you so much.